We have a great second panel, which is going to concentrate on financing. And as they're coming down here, Michael Francois is the moderator for this panel. Michael is the director of the real estate development for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, where he oversees real estate services, World Trade Center redevelopment, and the Trans-Hudson Express Tunnel divisions. I suspect you spend very little time sleeping. And I'm not going to introduce the rest of the panel. Michael's going to take care of that. And again, you have their bios there. And we're going to try to shoot for around 10 minutes to 12. Okay. Thank you.
We're going to address one of the more mundane but essential elements of urban development. It's called money. It's probably more about cap rates and IRR splits than it's about vision, but it's extremely essential. This panel should address how regional economic development agencies finance development projects. Or in view of today's present condition in the capital markets, this panel could also be called In Search of the Holy Grail. We have gathered here a very, very interesting panel with some very experienced economic development professionals, each and every one of which I've worked with for many years on some very exciting and major projects. I think we all know that effectuating economic development projects can be a very challenging task, and that these particular projects require a lot of resources. Since everybody's giving you a top Letterman 10 on, basic elements to effectuate, let me give you at least my view of what elements should be addressed in order to successfully implement a development project. Number one, I think a thorough and realistic pre-development analysis, which results in an agreed upon both physical and financial development plan, is absolutely essential. It comes to the vision statement. And I think it also is critical in building an early consensus and support for the project. Another element is an effective land assemblage strategy that secures a site for development. If you don't have a site, you don't have a development. I was talking to Alexander on the way down in regard to the Penn Station project, and there's an interesting book called Conquering Gotham. And it's all about the original tunnel and development of Penn Station. And the first half of the book is truly about the challenges the Penn Railroad had in assembling all the property in New York. A third one is a process that ensures that all permits and approvals are secured and within a reasonable time frame. Thirdly, or fourthly, I should say, an agreement with an experienced and competent development entity and an agreed-to development structure that more or less formalizes the roles and responsibilities of the various parties. And last but not least, the subject that we're on today, financing. This particular panel, I hope, will finance or focus on the various financing and funding vehicles which are necessary for project development. Funding and financial support can come in various forms and may address both capital and operating needs of the developer. Providing financing assistance, and I'm not going to go to granular, but from a big picture standpoint, providing financial assistance to development projects can be as simple or complicated as the project itself. One of the simplest forms of assistance is a grant, such as a USEDA Title I grant or various forms of technical assistance with the Port Authority sometimes gives out. Those days are kind of long and gone, but I remember them in my prehistoric economic development days. A more traditional mechanism is the direct loan or the project bond, which most of the panelists offer in one form or another. Related to direct financing are loan guarantees or credit enhancements, which tend to leverage the private financing sources. Besides assisting in the capital cost of the project, there are a variety of development incentives which provide operating subsidies to the project, such as tax abatement programs, job training assistance, and rent abatements. And Seth and I have talked at great length about all these various subsidies. The most complex form of financing assistance are associated with public-private partnerships or joint ventures, where ground leases, equity investments, and lease commitments are effectively, hopefully, employed. In the course of this discussion today, hopefully, each panel or panelist will briefly describe the purpose or mission of his or her agency, as well as summarize how their agency provides financial assistance and economic development incentives to projects. Again, not only do we have an outstanding panel of experienced public development executives who will share their thoughts, but I think we have convened them at a very propitious time. The capital and bond markets are in a state of turmoil, which makes raising capital and selling bonds very challenging, and I'm sure Caren knows this very well, and the Port Authority knows it extremely well. And also the county and region are on the cusp of a recession, if we are not already in one, making economic development a very hot issue. The people on this panel are basically the go-to individuals that our public officials and the private development community can rely on to help mitigate the downturn of the economy. So maybe we can learn from them some of the new programs in their portfolio. I will start off with Caren. She's closest to me. Caren and I have a long history. It's not years, I think it's decades. I think she heads up one of the most innovative economic development and real estate development entities in the country. Her resume speaks for herself. And introduce Caren Franzini.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm going to thank Rich Keevy and the Woodrow Wilson School for pulling this together. I always like coming to conferences where I can steal other people's good ideas. And this is definitely one of those. And it's great hearing from people from other states. I hope to get some of your great financing ideas. So watch out, I'm going to take notes. When the EDA has been around for a long time, it's been around for 35 years. And I think, as you heard from Peter Longstreth and also from Rich, so the governor definitely sets the policy criteria for how we act. But right now, with New Jersey facing a $2 billion plus budget, it's deficit, it's really great not being part of the state budget. So we do not rely on the state of New Jersey to finance our operations. We're totally financially independent, which is critical. It's critical for the state for us working with the state, and that we don't have to rely on them for operating dollars. We have to think and operate like a business. So the bottom line is every deal that we do has to make financial sense, because we have to rely on the revenues to come back to help the next project. So the mindset going in is we have a public mission, but we operate like a private bank. It's the best of both possible worlds. We're kind of like a bank, but we don't accept deposits, and we have a public mission, and that we only should do projects that make economic sense for the state of New Jersey. So it's a great way of going into a project. We're talking about numbers. I like the numbers 3. There are 3 things that I like to look at. One, is there a vision for what we're doing, especially on the large-scale projects? Is there a real vision that makes sense? Is the plan realistic? Does the developer have the wherewithal to get it done? I can't tell you how many plans we've seen where a mayor has come in, former mayor, with a developer and said, this plan is going to redo this neighborhood and they're great and it's wonderful. There's nothing there. So you have to be able to say what's realistic, and also have the confidence in yourself, have the financial resources to say this is not going to work. But if you do X, Y, and Z, if you bring in a financial partner, if you do some other things, you can get it to work, but you need these elements. And 3 is you have to have a strong organization to back it up. We have a staff of 160 people. They are all professionals in the field of finance, real estate development. We steal them from banks. We steal them from real estate development companies. Sometimes we lose them to other great organizations like we lost Mike. But you have to have competent people in the industry, because if you're negotiating with bankers, you're negotiating with developers, you have to be as smart as they are, or else you're going to have failed projects. So that are my 3 things. We focus our energies in 4 areas. 1 is urban development. 2 is attracting high-tech companies, innovation companies. Three, although Bruce talked about the dying manufacturing industry, we are still focused on manufacturing, and some of the manufacturing is manufacturing of medical devices. So it's not the old line smokestack manufacturing, it's what are we good at putting things together. And the fourth area is small business. Women, minorities, small business, bread and butter of what we do every day, loans, guarantees. But what I'm going to focus on is urban because I think that's really where the focus needs to be. I'm going to focus on a couple of financing structures, not to have you experts in them, but to make you realize, as Mike said, you have to be creative. There used to be 20 years ago something called UDAGs. And you just went to the federal government, got this UDAG grant, and put it right into the project. That was your equity, made the deal done. It was great. Doesn't exist anymore. So it means you have to be smarter, and it's kind of more fun because the less money you have, the more creative you have to be. I'm going to talk about 4 projects just to give you a sense of the variety of financing tools it takes to get it done. One is the project I really love to talk about because it's such a beautiful project. I wish I had a picture of it. It's 1180 Raymond Boulevard in Newark. Great developer, New York City developer, Cogswell, came across the river, came to Newark, took a beautiful old building, and decided he wanted to renovate it for housing. Did a fantastic job, but let me list off the number of financing that went into it. It was historic tax credits, the Bank of America, Fannie Mae, Prudential, HMFA, our sister housing agency, the Amelia Foundation, and EDA. A lot of financing to get the deal done. What was the bottom piece that the EDA piece was involved in is something in the rest of the country called TIF financing, tax increment financing. In New Jersey, we have to do it differently. We have 2 forms called RAB, R-A-B financing, or Revenue Allocation District financing. But what it is you take incremental taxes that the project is coming to bear into a municipality and put it back into the project. So in this case, you had a vacant building, and all of a sudden they were going to start paying taxes to the city of Newark. Newark agreed to take a percentage of those taxes and give them to EDA to give to bondholders to basically to pay about $8 million of this $108 million financing. So the way the city's looking at it is right now I'm receiving no property taxes to speak of because it's vacant. I'm now going to get X millions of dollars a year. I'm willing to give up a piece of it to pay for the infrastructure that's needed to get this project done and to really be a turnaround kind of project in downtown Newark. So that is a creative financing, is how do we use property taxes? And you have to be careful. In New Jersey, there's a big issue around pilots called payment in lieu of taxes. And what it does is the municipality gets all the taxes, but then the school district gets nothing, nor the county. We're telling all developers, you can't ignore the school districts. You really have to sit and talk and give some money back to the school districts because you're not fulfilling some of your visions, so of what you want to achieve. The second one that we're utilizing in New Jersey is trying to get other people's money, especially the federal government's, New Markets Tax Credit. New Markets Tax Credit was supposed to be like the old UDAGs. It is the most confusing. There's no one here. Beth, don't write this. I wish it was more like the housing tax credit. The housing tax credit people know how to use and understand. The New Markets Tax Credit, so many lawyers and financial consultants have been hired to how to use this financial product. But we went for it anyway and got a $125 million allocation. We converted our allocation to make it more user-friendly into a loan product. So basically we sold our tax credits and got money in to make loans. And one of the first projects we did I'm most proud of, we took in Trenton, the Mayor Palmer, great mayor, very committed urban mayor, he had started up a new economic development corporation. Great idea. Going back to my first point, it had no organization structure behind it. First big project they took on, build an office building. They had no experience. Zero experience in doing an office building. The office building got half completed, and then the mayor was faced with a half-completed office building in downtown Trenton. To his credit, he said, that didn't work, which is a hard thing for a mayor to do. Let me go out, do an RP, and bring in a private developer to come into the city and take over the project. And he did. Got a private developer, Matrix Development came in, but they needed financing. So we provided $6.5 million through our New Markets Tax Credit, subordinated financing to get the deal done. Each project is unique and it needs the unique financing. We were very committed to it because it's the heart of the downtown. The city was behind it. It was bringing a major employer from the suburbs into the downtown, which we thought was a good thing. The last thing that we were really focusing on, and it's not done yet, but we're hoping we'll get done soon, and Bruce talked about earlier, is put money in infrastructure. That's where we really should put money in. Right now we're working in the city of Camden, and we're working to keep Campbell Soup in Camden and to expand in Camden, and putting all the public dollars in infrastructure in terms of sewer and road network. And Campbell Soup is committed to put $70+ million to expand their own facility. As important, though, not just to expand the building, but to take a stake in that neighborhood and say that we want to be the master developer and try to attract other businesses to downtown Camden, which is great for a city like J&J New Brunswick. You have to have that leader to bring in other towns, bring in other businesses. The fourth, hopefully you'll hear from Gary Rose, great new program the state of New Jersey just developed around urban transit hubs and using a tax credit to get it done. And finally, one of the things I've worked a lot with Mike on in a regional approach is looking at our ports. In terms of our urban strategy, we spend a lot of time on looking at our ports, on looking at how do we create interest there, and a lot that again is where we're spending money on infrastructure. We're spending money on cleanup dollars. We're spending money on getting developers through the DEP process in New Jersey, and then providing some subordinate financing to get the buildings up and running. So what I go back to again, just to repeat, I think you have to have the right vision for some of these complicated projects. They have to be realistic, and you have to be able to say no when they don't make sense. And then you have to make sure you have the right organization behind it to finance it, or else I think you're open to failure. Thank you very much.
Introduce our next panelist, Kevin Corbett. Kevin is presently Vice President of Corporate Development at Dimgen Harris. He also had been Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President of the Empire State Development Corporation. I met Kevin when we were negotiating, or evaluating, I should say, the Silverstein financial plan for the World Trade Center. And Kevin and Charlie Gargano and Empire State Development Corporation was very instrumental in basically restructuring, helping us restructure that whole lease. So, Kevin?
Thank you, Mike. For me being back in at Woodrow Wilson, I just when I came here 12 years ago and was doing my graduate work, I'd spent most of my career in international shipping, did a lot of work with the federal government, and I was expecting to go back to China where I'd lived for 6 years, and my courses were national security interests, working with Aaron Freeberg, and then you look at my CV and what's happened since. I met and married a woman who was working at Lewis Thomas Lab and had 3 children in 4 years, and so. But I would say several of the courses I've had, particularly one by George Downs, was reform in government and what can you do, and how things get done in government, what reforms happened and when they didn't, why they didn't, etc. And there's usually a reason. And I'm bringing that now to the project level. I'll talk about finance, but not so much what the percentage of tax exempt should be, how many basis points, the structure of a pilot or pilots. I mean, you're glad to answer questions about that. But I think I'll give a little bit. I serve on a couple of comments picking up, including Richard, that what makes projects get done, and less finance, but the funding and how to put projects together with some of the funding. I'll make some comments on that. And I think I currently serve on Empire State Development Board. I worked with the Spitzer administration on the transportation transition, and on the Javits board and the Economic Development Power Allocation Board. And I think Empire State Development, which is the outgrowth and really still legally the heir of UDC, has some really unique powers. And it seems in crisis, like Richard had the one with created UDC Act, hopefully not every urban environment will have to get to the place where you have a crisis to get things done, but I suspect to get those kind of powers, again, you really will have that. The power of condemnation in structuring the deals, it's the threat of it more than the use of it. I think, some of the, and talking with Mike and with Bob, to get a lot of these projects done, the funding will come from various sources, what's the public-private mix, or certain projects it depends a lot on the politics. My view is within Empire State Development, or what were the projects that could get done, where the stars line up, and how we be focused. I was an apolitical. I've been, I look at where the politics is. Okay, well, here, what are the major projects that really stand a chance of getting done? And I believe very much in a strong state role. I've seen that effective, and in the role I'm in now, internationally and nationally, you go in and you have to smell, a sense of smell, what's really, which projects are real, what developers are real, what companies are real. And then from the political side, where you're going to get the consensus. And I'll give a few examples in a second. One of the roles, though, of projects is aside from the financing, is still sort of the role of grants, and I think Caren put it very well, the infrastructure. One example that we did Empire State Development a few years back was getting the infrastructure, a $1.1 billion investment by IBM in Dutchess County, a 300-millimeter chip fab. The chip fab and all the jobs that come with that, and tying that into the universities, what kind of courses. And Richard touched on it as well, having professional staff. It is a lot tougher nowadays to be competitive. If you hire somebody who makes more than $100,000, even if they can make $400,000 or $500,000 in the private sector, page 3 of the New York Post, they'll have some ridiculous thing, and if they happen to go to look at another plant somewhere overseas, then it's a picture of a postcard with in this fancy hotel in that city, and the person is blacklisted for having gone to see a major client, that kind of thing. So the environment is definitely difficult to operate in, but you have to learn to deal with that and get through those issues. But in the case of IBM, that was about $50 million of grants, or cobbled through Department of Transportation, some local grants, working with a local IDA. There was some bonding involved, but basically it was $50 million that IBM had a campus up there that they then decided, with a lot of competition, to finally come down and locate it. So it really wasn't. When you look at the return, I think that was one of the better examples of where you could do sort of corporate retention or expansion, and that's an element of economic development that I think both state agencies have. I think on the project side, even looking at some of the retentions, one of the things is to get any project done is how do you work with the locals, with the IDA, from a state perspective. And I'd say, interesting in politics, if you think that being from the same party is an advantage, don't count on that at all. Usually it's a disadvantage. I saw Governor Pataki battling with Governor Whitman, and Governor Pataki and Jim McGreevey got along great. And there was a lot that was done. I mean, you look at, George Warrington coming in with ARC. I mean, so that filter is an interesting dynamics in and of itself. So you watch the politics, but those don't necessarily be discouraged by it. And I think one of the big changes, and the reason I mentioned that was thinking of New York City, with New York City EDC, which when I came in was very political in the Giuliani administration, with Mayor Bloomberg, and there were pros and cons of that, but working with EDC, when Andy Alper, that's the predecessor, who was a great person to work with, that came from the mayor, but was very professional, and indicatively, say for bond fees, the issuer of the bond fees usually gets a feedback, the IDA or whatever. And when we had the Liberty bonds for the recovery of Lower Manhattan, we agreed that we would just pool the fees and split it 50-50. So we wouldn't be having the state going out trying to get to a company and having the city. We did a business recovery grant program and small grant, a whole comprehensive plan that worked just the relationship. People didn't know they were dealing with an EDC person or an ESDC person half the time. And I think that program was effective and took extremely good leadership from Mayor Bloomberg and his team. I'm personally concerned what will happen when he leaves, but that's for the next forum. I think on the project funding, I think a couple of examples are 42nd Street redevelopment. And again, it's funny, projects will start in one administration, the next administration gets credit for it, and that's the nature of the beast. But the flexibility, and particularly in this time of material costs going up, not so much inflation, just really challenges we face, Port Authority's facing on a lot of projects, is how do you phase and where's the flexibility? If you have certain projects, say on the Javits Center, for example, I'm on the board, I think everyone's seen that whatever the plan was and its flaws, it just within a couple of years, when you have the steel, concrete going up at 20 to 30%, and you had very fixed, rigid financing, and in a project that basically could not be phased, you were in a situation that you had either go back for an appropriation in a bad budget time, or the project was going to be dead. And it's, Pat Foy did totally the right thing as chairman, looking and saying, we don't have the money. And the governor said, listen, we're not going to give you another $1 billion, even if that's just not in the cards. Whereas 42nd Street, aside from the assemblage, and aside from the power of condemnation, there's also the ability, particularly in New York, to override the zoning, to do state zoning rather than the Euler process, which has a very valuable role. But for certain times in certain projects where there's a real consensus and time is your enemy, once you have that consensus, being able to override Euler is extremely valuable. And again, from the state, you cannot run roughshod over the local government, and because you will end up having it backfire. But I would say, 7 World Trade Center, that is sort of taken for granted. But actually, had to remap one of the streets, I think it was Greenwich, coming down, and because of Con Ed and all these complicated issues, the ability to bypass Euler and be able to get that street remapped and reconfigured is one of those things that was off anybody's radar screen. But if you went through a whole Euler process that would have taken a couple of years, that building would still be under construction now. So those are aspects, not exactly funding, but that tie in with the time and the sort of the background to that. I think the Farley project, for Alex and I, I want to make sure I'm not going to die. I may live to 150, but I'm not dying until that project's finished. But how that is morphed with the funding, and I think this gets into what kind of funding for what kind of project. As grand as the project is, there was really a dislocation as far as what was transportation funding. Is it a transportation project or an economic development project? And that, once you see the nature of the project, that's going to affect a lot of what is your funding options of sources you can go to. The TIFIA program, for example, in the initial first phase of this of Farley, before Madison Square Garden was going to come in, there was a significant TIFIA role, and Washington was interested, Federal DOT was interested in having us explore TIFIA. Port Authority element, the commitment of the Port Authority was critical, really as a transportation, but using the Port Authority's economic development role there. And I think it was fortuitous, particularly that George Warrington did take on, came from Amtrak, and I may even say maybe it was his successor, David Gunn, who was a different kind of man. I think when George left Amtrak and became the head of New Jersey Transit, he was interested in filling the void because the MTA did not want to go in there. They did not want to put more than $35 million into Farley. And we had a funding gap. We had certain basic funding. UDC had some bonds they could issue against retail. But the gap was actually filled by New Jersey Transit, where George Warrington said, okay, we will fund, it wasn't a huge amount of money, but we'll be able to give you a capacity of $3 to $4 million a year that you can then bond against. And that was the difference, the delta we needed to allow the project to go forward. And they would take the hall and have some ticket kiosks and all. But that element of funding and that bi-state cooperation also led the way for ARC at that point. And I think also with Mayor Bloomberg, although the city has a relatively smaller role in the financing of it, and they have I think it's 60 million, Seth, in the original, 154 now, right? It is now, yeah. But the original one, I think, was around 60 million at the time when the Giuliani administration committed, and it's mushroomed as a project's own. But the importance of Mayor Bloomberg, again, leadership, saying, of course, Andy Alper having come from Goldman Sachs, saying, Summit is what they call Summit, New Jersey, Golden Ghetto, But the mayor understood, and Andy understood certainly, the importance of being of New Jersey and that regional economy. So can you get a regional appreciation, that kind of consensus? It's not frequent, but it is possible. And I think, because of that, both ARC, which has, strong support now from New York, and the Farley project has, strong support from New Jersey, we've had a really happy confluence. How the issues, how that'll play out with the funding gap that's still there is a challenge, but that's when I believe that we'll get sorted out, both as a transportation project and as an economic development project, which is I see as really being key for the development of the West Side, and the other thing that the RPA and we're all working on the West Side development. Okay, I guess keep it short. The question about the recession, one of the questions that we were asked was, how does the recession going to affect projects on the financing? The turmoil in the bond market, if I could answer how that's going to play out over the next month, I'd be at the racetrack instead of here. But, you know, the markets tend to come to an equilibrium, and I think the recession actually offers some opportunities. In New York currently, the labor markets are extremely tight. We have a dramatic shortage in the company I work for of engineers globally. Anybody knows any engineers, by the way, please see me afterwards. We're desperate. The E-Quad, I should be over there. It's here. I think the financing somewhat is sort of the least of the problems in getting projects done in New York and New Jersey. I look at one, not to put Seth on the spot, but where you have a general agreement, say like New York Container Terminal in Staten Island. You know, everybody has good projects, you need broad support, but the Port Authority has a certain view of what they should get from their share. The city has their view. From what I can see, that's sort of dragging out, and it may drag out to the point that the private sector, with the project cost escalating, that project may or may not be able to go ahead just because the time loss. So that's what I'll be curious to see how that plays out. But those kind of issues, the recession though may actually allow you have less opportunities, but I think it does pull you in to the ones you have being more credible, and that you can really focus on getting some major projects done and getting a consensus. If there's a political consensus, politicians do like to have groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings. So pulling in the different elements to the financing part, and recession may actually allow some of the projects to go ahead that otherwise right now we just aren't making it because of the cost, et cetera. I think from the different instrumentalities involved with the finance, depends with Seth. There are questions can talk about particularly when we had the pilot, for example, and Liberty bonds for the New York Times building. That was an interesting. So there's some interesting examples but I think, as Caren said, each project really, the financing is really a case by case. There isn't the simple just give a grant and it goes anymore.
If you didn't have a potential conflict, Kevin, you could probably arbitrate between Seth and I in regard to how it works. We've heard from the states, and we're now going to hear from the local perspective. Seth Pinsky was recently appointed president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation by Michael Bloomberg. Seth's tenure at EDC more or less somewhat mirrors my tenure at the Port Authority. We've worked together on a number of projects in regard to discretionary incentives for the world trade. Seth is trying to implement a major affordable housing project in New York City in Queens West. And he is also trying to bring port fields to New York, I understand. So, Seth Pinsky.
Thanks, Mike. First of all, just a quick background on EDC. The New York City Economic Development Corporation is a 501c3, kind of like the EDA, and like the EDA, it allows us to operate outside of the budget of the city. We're actually a net contributor to the city's budget rather than a recipient of money from the city. And we receive our funds through a variety of ways, but the major ones are that the city has transferred to EDC a significant amount of real estate because as a non-city agency, we're not subject to all of the procurement rules, the civil service rules that the city itself is subject to, and so it's more efficient for us to undertake some of the roles that the city would normally undertake with land. So we dispose of land for private development. We also manage land both to generate income, but also for economic development purposes. We manage, for example, the Hunts Point food markets, which are among the largest food markets in the world, major industrial parks in Brooklyn and the Bronx, etc. We also work as kind of the outside / inside consultant to the city when the city is involved in major financial transactions, investments in projects. We'll act as a strategic consultant looking at large questions like sustainability. The mayor's 30-year sustainability plan, Plan-YC, EDC was very intimately involved in the planning of that, and also as kind of an in-house investment banker for the city, trying to make sure that the city is getting the benefit of its bargain. So what I wanted to talk about today, at the risk of asking a somewhat academic question in an academic setting where people spend a lot of time thinking about these things, probably a lot more than I do. The question I wanted to ask was, why is it that government needs to finance any projects at all? And the reason for that is the hypothesis that I'll throw out there is that in many cases there's a disconnect between the investment that's needed for any sort of project and the returns. And a good example of that is a park. And by the way, there are lots of non-financial reasons for doing things, but from a financial perspective, it's very hard for someone to collect the revenues that are generated by the creation of a park, but there's no question that there are economic benefits as well as non-economic benefits to having parkland. Central Park is a great example. The real estate around Central Park is worth far more than it would be if there were no Central Park there. But a private developer who went out and built the park would have a hard time realizing those. A public entity has a methodology for collecting the returns, and that's that we tax the economy generally. And so if there's more economic activity, we'll get some of the benefit of that, and therefore we can generate returns. Also, as I mentioned, there are non-financial returns, which as a political entity we're concerned with and the private sector wouldn't be. So another reason why the government may be involved is that you may in fact be able to measure the returns from a project and in fact internalize the returns from a project, but they may just be insufficient to make a project worthwhile. And again, there may be non-financial reasons why you would want to do a project. For example, toll road. There are lots of toll roads that get built. It can be financed by private entities, but there's also political pressure to keep tolls low. And so there's a certain risk that the politics will outweigh the dollars and cents at some point in the future. And so even with a toll road, sometimes it would be difficult to find a private sector investor who's willing to undertake the project. So I think the traditional model of government financing is for these kinds of projects where either the returns are insufficient or the returns are softer and harder to realize. And in the city of New York, we do obviously plenty of that. We build parks all the time with the state. Actually, most of the state, but building 2nd Avenue subway. The city is financing an extension of the number 7 train to the far west side. Those are all examples of these kinds of projects. But there are obviously some problems that come with public sector financing of infrastructure projects and other projects. First of all, the public sector has a reputation for often being inefficient. Sometimes that's undeserved, sometimes it's well-deserved. Also, it's very hard for the public sector, again, viewing these projects purely from a financial perspective, it's very hard for the public sector to measure the financial returns, even if we're able to internalize some of them. It's hard for us, and I'll admit this, we in economic development are often making the case for our projects by saying that they're going to generate X billion dollars in additional taxes, and that's twice as much as we're investing. But those numbers are really, really hard to predict. They're almost impossible to measure afterwards because it's very hard to figure out what the counterfactual in a large economy would have been. So that's an issue. And in the environment in which we're now living, where there's very high public sector debt, there's an unwillingness to raise taxes, it's just hard to find the money for these projects. So as a result of that, the trend in recent years, which others have spoken about beforehand, is the public-private partnership. And this is basically an attempt by the public sector to leverage the ability of the private sector to act more efficiently, sometimes to act more rationally, and also at times to raise capital more easily. There's kind of a spectrum of public-private partnerships. I think the most traditional and maybe the simplest to understand is where you basically have a private sector development, but there are public sector elements to it. And those are either public sector elements that the private sector developer will want, or that are imposed on the private sector development through the planning process. There's open space that needs to be built. There's new roadways that need to be built. The parts of the project that are like the things that the government normally would finance on its own. So one way that the public and the private sector would enter into a partnership would be to literally split the project up and say, okay, these are the public elements, we'll pay for the public elements, these are the private elements, you pay for the private elements, you get all the returns from the private elements, we generate the returns through the way that we generate returns for the public elements more traditionally, which is that we'll just collect more in taxes, and that's how we'll get paid back. Really what this is just a subsidy of a private sector development. It's not a bad word necessarily, but that is what it is. And it's basically the public sector giving free capital. And examples of these kinds of projects that we've done in the last few years, and there are kind of two subcategories of these. With the Mets Stadium, for example, that's being built in Queens, it's an $800-ish million project, $900 million, something like that. And the public sector basically paid the Mets $160 million, the state and the city combined, and said, devote these to the public sector portions of your project, but you build the whole thing. Another model is slight variation on that with the Yankees, with their stadium, which is $1 billion-ish stadium. Basically what we did was we said there are public portions of the stadium project. There's new parks that need to be built to replace the parkland that the new stadium was going on in the Bronx. There are parking garages that need to be built. We'll pay for those. We'll build those. You pay for the stadium, and the two projects are basically separate projects. And there are pros and cons to each of these approaches. The pros in the first example is that you get the advantage of the private sector efficiency, and also in the case of the Met Stadium, the private sector is taking the risk of the cost overruns, which is a big deal, especially when you have public sector involved. You also, in these kinds of projects, unlike, say, just building a new roadway, you have the advantage of knowing that there is a specific private sector investment that's coming with your public sector investment, and you're not just hoping that it's going to generate the returns. And so it may be a little bit easier to measure whether or not it's a rational decision. But there are also disadvantages in the case of the Yankee Stadium model, and there are flip sides to both these advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is that the public sector is now building a large portion of the project, and so you deal with the public sector inefficiency. If there are cost overruns, which in this case we're going to do, I think, a decent job of keeping them from being too big, but there will be some cost overruns. Those are borne entirely by the public sector. But the advantage of that model, which is the disadvantage of the Mets model, is that when you have the private sector doing all the building, the private sector doesn't have the same cares and concerns as the public sector does, and so there is pressure that they're constantly applying. Well, let's shrink the open space. Let's do fewer public amenities because it doesn't generate revenue for them. And then you've got just the basic problem, which is the problem that I first posited, which is that it's very hard to measure the returns of these investments. Even when you're talking about a specific project, it's hard to say what the incremental revenues are when you're building a stadium that's next to an existing stadium. So how do you measure whether the investment that we're making, the city in this case or the state, how do you measure whether that's a good investment or a bad investment? The other issue that we face is just time pressure, and this is a problem with all public sector investments because of the political calendar. The private sector knows that, especially when you're term limited, that the public sector political players have a limited time to get things done. And so, they can just threaten to sit on their hands, and even if you know that it's irrational for them to do so, there's a real risk that you face because at the end of the mayor's, in this case, 8 years, he's going to be judged on what was built and what wasn't built. So there's another model, which is one that we in the city are trying to move towards, which also has its own tricky elements, but it's a slight variation on that public-private partnership model, which is to make it more of a true partnership rather than make it a subsidy. And this can be done in a project where the private sector is building the entire project, or in the model where you're splitting the public sector elements from the private sector elements. But what you basically do in this model is that the public sector will make an investment in the project one way or another, and then there will be an agreement that if the project surpasses certain returns to the private sector players, that the public sector will then share in those returns. And the idea behind that basically is that when the public sector is making investments in projects, going back to my original hypothesis, the only reason the public sector should be making these investments is because it's needed to get the project done. There's a reason why the private sector otherwise wouldn't do it on its own. And it's very difficult when you're looking forward at a project, even if you were the world's most sophisticated investor, to know, what is exactly the right amount of money that's needed, because you don't know what exactly the returns of the project are going to be. And in many cases in the government, we're not the world's most sophisticated investors, and we're going up against very sophisticated people, people who have a lot of experience with development and finance, et cetera. And I'd like to think that we're not, but sometimes the government is outclassed in those cases. And so with this model, you solve that risk a little bit because you can be a little less careful about how much money you're putting in front, because on the back end, if it turns out that you really didn't need to put the money in, you'll get your money back. That should make the whole process go more smoothly. There are some downsides, though, to this. You still run into an argument with the developers over what a fair return is. And a good example of where we're doing this right now is on the Moynihan Station project, where we've been engaged in very long and arduous negotiations with the joint venture that's looking to construct the project. And one of the major arguments that went on for months with them, we all agreed on a model. So whether or not that model really reflects reality, we all agreed that this is what we would structure the deal around. We thought it was a reasonable model. But we were then arguing, okay, if this is what the future looks like, is it reasonable for you to get a 15% return before we start participating, or a 20% return, or a 10% return? So that's one thing that's not solved by this. And there's not a magic number that works for every project. There's not a magic number that works at all times either. Also, it can make us sometimes a little bit careless because we're not so worried about how much money we put in, given that we know on the back end we'll be made whole if turns out that we over-incentivize the project. And then the last, which I think is actually the most serious problem, is that we're really just horrible at monitoring these projects. And there are two problems with that. One is that these developers that we'll do a deal with will have every incentive not to make profits in whatever it is that they're reporting to us, and they will spend a lot of money to hire the best advisors to make sure that their financials show that that's what happened. And also, you need good people to monitor these projects. And when you're facing tight budgets and you're choosing between hiring a teacher or hiring a person to monitor a contract, you can guess what the choice is going to be, and maybe that's the right choice, but if you do that, you're not going to get anything. And I could point probably to half a dozen projects that the city did, and under the Bloomberg administration, we haven't done a lot of these for this very reason, but that we've done in past administrations where I am positive that the developers have made enormous returns off of those projects, and we, the city, have seen not a penny from them. And that's a serious issue. So I guess the bottom line lesson is that I think in the current environment, these public-private partnerships are probably the only realistic way to do mega projects, mega developments. And I think that in theory they can work very well, and they align interests much better than, especially if you do the second model of public-private partnerships. But it requires very careful negotiation, and it also requires monitoring. And if you don't monitor the project, the whole architecture collapses. So.
You've all just kind of described the evolution of public finance from grants to public-private partnerships. And Caren, you'll be comforting to know that I think Bill Lowenstein was involved in the Yankee Stadium financing. Two quick questions, if you don't mind. Obviously, we talked about public-private partnerships, joint ventures. Questions to you. Do you see, obviously, the public agencies going in that direction because of the limitation of capital, et cetera? And what do you see as more or less the risks and limitations of public agencies engaging in public-private partnerships?
Go ahead, you can start.
I'd say, yeah, I agree with Seth. I think that is, for the majority of models, I think the risks are the monitoring and making sure that you have shrewd negotiations. One thing, I think getting core professional staff in that negotiation, and Richard's comment, which I wish I had known earlier about, paying, that idea of paying the value for your best legal and financial, you want to be as equally armed as on the other side, and that's the risk, because particularly in a place like New York, there's no lack of very, very sophisticated talent. When you see, the top people from Goldman Sachs on the other side, and without any disrespect to some of the people you may be next to, and you're looking, who may be good, career bureaucrats, but, you know what you're up against, like, whoa. So the public-private, you need to be, that's the risk of not having the horses, and that's where I said also, choose your projects. There are hundreds of projects in a place like New York, particularly the economy is strong anywhere. In New Jersey, a lot of projects going on. Which are the ones that really warrant public involvement? Because all the private companies are all profit-driven. The more money they can get out of you as a public sector, that's the measure there. So you have to be proactive in deciding what are the real focus, and that's sort of from an RPA perspective. What are the objectives from a public policy that we're trying to do as a public agency? The limitations I see to that are some projects do not lend themselves. I think one project I was involved with was the privatization of Stewart Airport. And somebody at a forum about a month ago said, why would they give it to a bus company? But at the time that was done at Stewart, it wasn't. It was the private sector changes, and corporations will change a lot even over a 5-6 year period. When National Express Group from the UK bought the lease for Stewart Airport, they had a number of airports, and they were aggressively expanding airports in Europe, and they wanted to expand to America, so it was a logical. Then they decided a few years later to pull out. Likewise, certain companies at the time may be fully committed. The company gets bought out or sold or changes. So that issue is there's certain things where the public sector does well, and certainly transportation projects. There's a lot of PPP going on right now. We see it in the ports. Who 5 years ago would have ever guessed, the Mar brothers would be billionaires? They didn't. I know that. But when you talk a project like ARC, for example, or even with Farley, where they're in Penn Station, there's significant private participation. But at the end of the day, some projects lend themselves very much to government funding. And there's really, if you look at the major transportation infrastructures around this country with the kind of the structure we have from the federal level down, you really have to look for a public sector solution. There may be some private options, but you really have to look at the public sector, and the PPP will not necessarily be an answer for that.
And I think each project is different, and the level of public-private partnership is going to differ depending on the project. And we did a project with Peter Longstreth when he was in the private sector in Camden with Mike, where there was a joint ownership of real estate to get, at the time, GE to stay in the city of Camden, and we literally formed a partnership. Tough project to get done at the time. They weren't willing to do it without any major public sector, and we weren't willing to do it by ourselves. But it's a very complicated structure. I think what we're seeing more and more, what we talked about, is that the private sector is taking the lead in it, and the public sector is doing what it does best with its infrastructure. And I know Gary's is here today, but I think that's what we've been doing with the governor is how do we take what we're good at, with the public sector money there, and also put it in a subordinated way. I agree with you. I think to monitor the equity on a return is too difficult on large-scale projects. We do it on small businesses. We take warrants in companies for tech companies. You can do it a lot easier for a small business than you can for a Fortune 100. It has more manpower than we would ever have.
Yeah, and I would just to expand on the point I was making about the monitoring, which as boring a topic as it is, I really, as I do more of these, I'm more and more convinced that that's the key to everything. We met at the city with infrastructure group from a major investment bank, and they came in and they were talking about a deal I think that they had done, someone had done with the toll road in Chicago, and They were saying that it was, it's a great project, and I said, well, are you worried at all about the standard of maintenance? And what they said is, oh, no, you don't have to worry at all. There's a 300-page contract, and it's so detailed it governs everything. If there's roadkill on the road, it tells you how many hours to the second that you have to remove that, and if you don't, there are financial penalties. And I think that what people forget, and as a lawyer I'm sensitive to this, is that contracts, in order to be effective, have to have two elements. One is that they have to give you the rights that you need, but the second is that they have to have counterparties that are actually monitoring. And especially the longer a contract, the amount of time that a contract spans, the more important the monitoring and the harder it is to maintain that, I think. And, we in this country, we're privatizing a lot of government functions. And not to veer off topic too much, but you see that in the military. We privatize huge portions of what traditionally the military did itself. And in and of itself, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but if someone's not paying attention to what your outsourced providers are doing, then there's a real opportunity to end up getting less than the services that you were expecting or paying more than you thought they were going to. And if we're not going to monitor, I personally think we shouldn't be outsourcing.
Good. One more question. Our regional elected officials have established smart growth and sustainability as major public policy objectives. Do you see your agencies starting to tailor your financing, programs and economic development objectives along those lines, and how do you do it?
Well, in New Jersey, the governor just signed into law something known as the Reggie Bill. It's no relationship to a person, but it's part of the governor's plans on energy efficiency to by the year 2020 to reduce our reliance by 20%. And in that, although there's some financing piece of it, but I think it starts to set the model for how do we as a state really approach clean energy and look at it. So there will be financing in there to really promote more energy efficiency, as well as the development of new technologies, which I know Congressman Holt is very much interested in. How do we bring new technologies into this area around clean energy and make that sustainable in terms of a business model? So we're thinking about that way in dealing with the private sector, but I think it's important to show leadership in our own buildings. So the governor created it in the governor's office, which I think, again, is important for that model. How do you start looking at our own state office buildings, creating it? I know we built a building in Camden, New Jersey, and it was the first LEED certified publicly owned building in the state to really show, one, in the city of Camden, and two, a state entity can build a LEED building to really serve as a model. So I think we had to show by our own example that's done. And fortunately, the private sector now is falling over each other to have it done as well. You see major corporations, major financial institutions realizing it. And I think the challenge to us now is to retrofit existing buildings. The residential is really important, but you're not going to get as much bang for your buck as you will from commercial. So how to create the big box retail, how to create all of our industrial buildings along the Portfields area, how do we make them more energy efficient? And I think that's where our focus as public entities should be, is how do we look at our existing stock and incentivize the commercial people to be more energy efficient.
Let's say in New York, at least, it's definitely, I think there's two things. One is sort of for the regular office kind of commercial, you have major buildings we've had at Battery Park City, Durst with their buildings on 42nd Street, and I think they see taking that from marketing it nationally and internationally. So I think there's, certainly the lead ones, lead architects. I mean, everywhere that's sort of the general buzz out there. I think there's also the fear factor, and particularly on some of the more industrial side, of looking at ports and developments around port areas, warehousing, distribution centers, all that, the actual port facilities themselves, is they see what happened out in Los Angeles, Long Beach, and I think that is where you had total gridlock and sort of really contentious, and I think a lot of people want to make sure that does not happen in front of you hit that kind of crisis.
And in the city with the mayor's sustainability plans, obviously been a very big initiative for him. We actually have a sustainability office that's charged with implementing the mayor's environmental plan. It includes, like in New Jersey, retrofitting buildings that we own or otherwise control. We at EDC also have put some, although we're still trying to figure out the right balance, some environmental standards on projects that we're involved in. It's always a trick because the projects that tend to come to us are the marginal projects that can afford it the least. So basically any additional cost that we put on the project, we're going to have to bear. There are societal benefits to doing that, and where the city has certainly chosen to do that in many instances, but we don't have limitless amounts of money either. So it makes it difficult. But I do think that what's interesting is that you are seeing in the private sector, because energy costs are going up and there's no sign that they're going to be coming down anytime soon, that actually is a rational investment for them to make. We were meeting with the team that's putting together the new Goldman Sachs headquarters a year or two ago. This was before energy prices really spiked. But I very distinctly remember that in our conversation they said, when we were planning the building, we put all sorts of environmentally friendly elements into it. And it was basically because we thought we'd get good PR. But afterwards, as we've started to look back at this, we realized that every single one of them makes business sense. And I think that's going to be a sea change in development going forward.
Great. We have time for questions. We have questions from the floor.
It's a very intriguing city as far as I often wonder what its potential is and what you think its potential for the city. See that when Philadelphia and being so close, easily accessible. Is it hurt by the fact that Philadelphia relative to Boston?
We have the best view in Camden, Philadelphia. It's the best piece of real estate because you have a great view. Actually, there's a piece of legislation passed a couple of years ago, and I think it's true of any city, that you have to build on its strengths. And what that legislation talked about, and I think the strengths of Camden are very different from Jersey City. You do have that financial model of New York City and Jersey City, and the cost differential is real and it's immediate. And in Philadelphia and Camden, you don't see as great of a cost differential. The strengths in Camden are really tied around the ports. They're tied around the universities and the hospitals. And so if you take those as your base of your economic base, then how do you grow it from there? The fourth piece has been really trying to take the entertainment piece, the cultural piece, and make a connection between Philadelphia. So Camden, although sometimes you don't see it, has had some real changes take place in each of those areas. We see Cooper Hospital is doing $200+ million major expansion in Camden, which is great. Rutgers is building a new law school. So we see the institution really investing in the city. We also have some great developers from Philadelphia coming to New Jersey, like Carl Dranoff, who's done great stuff in Philly, coming to Camden, which is great, and a waterfront that has its first new private developed office building ever. So the pocket and neighborhoods are really focusing on some major residential development happening. It's a long-term vision. So I think the vision is you build from the strengths, which is the core that you have. You go into the core neighborhoods and start building the residential. And you have to have a long-term commitment and vision from local governments behind it. The governor has now focused, because Camden's so important, of actually people are getting together on a weekly basis from all sectors to really figure out how do you build the education base, the safety base, the economic development base in the city. So it's long-term, but I think you build on the strengths that are there today. And I am an ever optimist. I'm from Atlantic City, so I think we can definitely see change occur.
One more question.
It's a huge consideration. I mean, first of all, Evan, I think you were alluding to, we've been in an extremely high inflation environment, cost of construction, partially in New York as a result of the success that we've had with our economic development. There's just an enormous amount of building going on and not enough people to do it. But if you lose a year on your schedule, your costs could escalate by 10, 15%. And when you're talking about projects that have billion-dollar price tags, that opens a huge hole in the project. Also, as I said, there are political considerations as well. The mayor sits in a bullpen at City Hall with a cubicle next to all of his deputy mayors, and in that bullpen he has a countdown clock that counts down to the second to the end of his administration. We're constantly reminded, I think there are 600 and something days left. And so, the message to us is get it done, and timing is everything, because, once that clock runs out, not the city's going to disappear, but it's not going to be our project.
I think we're going to have to break, but I'd like to thank Mike and Caren and Kevin